recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the virtual seminar as presented by Dr. David McEntire. Dr. McEntire is a professor in the Emergency Management Administration and Planning program in the Department of Public Administration at the University of North Texas. He teaches emergency management courses in both the undergraduate and graduate programs. He served previously as the coordinator for the EADP and PhD programs as the Associate Dean in the College of Public Affairs and Community Service. Dr. McEntire is the author of Disaster Response and Recovery, Introduction to Homeland Security, and the editor of Disciplines, Disasters, and Emergency Management. Dr. McEntire completed an instructor guide on disaster response operations for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and he has recently published chapters in the Handbook of Disaster Research, the Handbook of Disaster Management, and Emergency Management Principles and Practices for Local Government. Prior to coming to the University of North Texas in the fall of 1999, he attended the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. While pursuing his degree, he worked for the International and Emergency Services Department at the American Red Cross. Dr. McEntire recently was recognized as the 2010 Dr. B. Wayne Blanchard Award recipient for academic excellence in emergency management in higher education. So with that, we'll welcome Dr. Blanchard, and we will turn over the presentation to him. If you have questions, please raise your hands, or you can put them in the discussion board, and we'll get them as we go. Dr. McEntire, sorry about that. I'm going to pass the ball off to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Hagel-Gaines. I really appreciate that. And good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know a little bit about your university, and I know Millersville is a respected institution when it comes to emergency management. I know some of the faculty that have taught there or teach there, including Dr. Fisher, Dr. Yalda, Dr. Enerson. And I just want to commend each of the students for pursuing your education. I think education is really important to solving the challenges and problems that we face in general, but in particular with emergency management. And I think the added benefit is that there are financial, awards for pursuing your education. So I think you're all doing a great job by moving forward with your degrees. And I wish you the best of luck with that. Today, I'm going to be talking about a concept entitled spontaneous planning. And I have a few goals. One of the things I'd like to do is review Kretz's twin foundations of emergency management, which would be planning and improvisation. I'll talk about spontaneous planning, what I mean by that. And I hope to explore that concept in the context of the San Bruno pipeline explosion in California. I'll talk a little bit about the findings and also the implications of this research, which is very new and requires a lot of follow-up studies for sure. Well, as you know, planning is a major and important function in emergency management. It's one of the things that emergency managers do on a daily basis. They probably spend most of their time planning. So what is planning? Well, there's no solid consensus, of course, on what the concept means, but it's certainly something that we do before a disaster occurs. We try to anticipate what will happen, and planning helps us to think through the activities that will take place during response and recovery. Now, if we look at the research, a lot of this research has come from scholars like Quarantelli, but this research discusses some important principles for planning. So we know, for instance, that planning must be comprehensive. We have to look at all of the hazards that could impact us, the consequences of vulnerability and disasters, the actors that could be involved, and the functions that need to be performed. In addition, our planning must be based on actual behavior. So if we think, for example, that looting is going to be a major problem, we'll probably dedicate a lot of law enforcement personnel to that issue. What happens, however, if there's not a lot of looting? The same thing goes with evacuation. Our policies and plans on evacuation must be based on actual behavior. So will people leave? Will they be panicked in their exit of the community if there's a disaster? Or will they leave in an orderly fashion? And how many people will leave? Will everyone leave? Will some people be left behind, and will those people need assistance? We have to think about that in our planning. Well, planning, the purpose is to assign responsibility, who's doing what. We want to facilitate coordination. We want to make sure that there's harmony of activity during response and recovery. And of course, we want to avoid some common pitfalls. So Lee Clark has talked about avoiding the creation of fantasy documents, documents that have no bearing on reality. They're divorced from what's actually taking place in terms of disasters and emergency management. And Eric Alfterheide has talked about the paper plan syndrome, how we have to avoid that. I think a good example of this was witnessed with Hurricane Katrina. They had a plan, they knew what would occur, they knew they would have to evacuate people that could not evacuate themselves, they knew they had to shelter people, and yet it appears they didn't have the capabilities to implement the plan. So we have to avoid a paper plan syndrome. And then finally, we know that plans must be updated frequently, at least one time a year. Now, planning is important, and it's something that emergency managers should be involved in, but it's not the only solution to disasters, and the reason being is that our planning may be inadequate. We're not omniscient. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, so things can take us by surprise. Also, it's important to recognize that planning is different than managing. So there are certain skills that are helpful to plan, but just because you've done a good job planning or writing a plan doesn't necessarily mean that you'll do a good job managing the disasters. You might have some knowledge, but you might not have the skill set to manage disasters effectively, and so we have to recognize that difference. And then finally, and ironically, we really don't know a lot about planning. Even though it's one of the fundamental aspects of emergency management, we don't really know enough about planning as we should. Well, that brings up another concept, and this concept is that of improvisation. According to Krebs, this is also a foundation of emergency management. So the foundations would be planning and improvisation, planning before a disaster and improvising after a disaster. So let me talk a little bit about that. So what is improvisation? I'll let you read over some of the definitions here. Maybe it's related to our gut instinct and being flexible in a disaster. Maybe it's also related to what's known as bricolage. In other words, this is making do with what you have at hand. So imagine for a moment that you're on a deserted island and the only thing you have with you is a roll of duct tape. That duct tape could be used to do a lot of things for you. It could help you put a shelter together. It could help you bandage a wound. It could be used to fasten a tool out of a stick and a rock, for example. So part of improvisation is making do with what you have. The other part is reacting to the situation at hand. So it's not just implementing the plan, it's responding to the unique circumstances that a disaster presents to you. It's adapting to those events. And of course, improvisation is related to new and unanticipated consequences of disasters that we haven't necessarily thought through before they occur. Well, improvisation, we know from the literature, is extremely important. And what's interesting, I think, is that a lot of the practitioners have probably focused more on planning. A lot of the scholars have focused more on improvisation. And in reality, we probably need both of those functions to be performed to have effective emergency management. Well, improvisation is very important because we can't plan for everything. We can plan for generalities, but not the specifics of each individual disaster that will occur because we don't know the timing of the event, the magnitude of the event, the location of the event. All of that may shape how we respond in a disaster, which may or may not coincide with our plans. Let's see. Also, scholars like Mendonca have talked about wildcards, events that we don't anticipate. We have to make sure we're considering those when we respond to events. A good example of this would be the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. You know, the government and even perhaps the corporation involved was aware of the possibility of oil spills, but probably not at 3,600 feet below sea level. And so that creates some new issues that you have to deal with when you're responding to a disaster. In addition, plans, if we rely on them solely, they can be detrimental. For example, Virginia had no earthquake plan prior to the August 23rd, 2011 earthquake that impacted that community. Maybe another example would be Apollo 13. You've probably all seen that movie, where the astronauts were, according to plan, supposed to use the command module as their place of residence or their location where they would live while they're traveling through space. Instead, since that did not, there were some problems with that, they ended up using the lunar module. It wasn't designed for that purpose, but that's what they did. So improvisation can be very helpful, but there are some potential problems with improvisation. Is it totally divorced from plans? Is it totally separate? Hopefully not, because we've spent a lot of time on planning. Also, do we have full situational awareness when a disaster occurs? Is our intuition correct? Think about Mayor Nagin before Hurricane Katrina. He delayed in issuing an evacuation warning or recommendation because he thought the storm would veer to the north and east and maybe miss New Orleans. And obviously that proved to be incorrect. Let's see. We also need to make sure we're thinking about the consequences of our actions. And if we're improvising, maybe we haven't really thought through the implications of what we're deciding to do, whether it's our policy or our procedures that we're implementing. So with all of that in mind, I'll again stress the importance of both planning and improvisation, but note that there's some weaknesses that we have to consider as well. And that brings up what I term spontaneous planning. And so this is a fairly new concept that I have introduced with my colleagues. And basically, when I talk about spontaneous planning, we're almost creating new plans as we respond. So concurrently while we're responding, we're trying to figure out what we're going to be doing. So let me give you some definitions of what this means. I'll let you look over this. So when I talk about spontaneous planning, it's kind of a semi-formal process of decision making where we're looking at the situation at hand, what problems we're encountering, what we might want to do in terms of options to solve them, and then we're trying to figure out which one might be best. So in reality, it's kind of a decision-making exercise. So to help us understand spontaneous planning, let me just mention that it's not the same thing as planning, because planning occurs before a disaster. And spontaneous planning typically occurs either immediately before a disaster or even during a disaster. So there's a difference there. Secondly, it's not the same thing as an improvisation, because spontaneous planning may inform what we do to be creative and flexible in a disaster. So we're looking at the options, the pros and cons of possible courses of action, and then this then would lead to response and recovery activities, which shape what we do after a disaster. So let me give you some examples of what this might include. Here's kind of a laundry list of things that could be included as part of spontaneous planning. Maybe it's assessing the environmental cues that exist after disaster. Perhaps it's thinking about our existing disaster plans and also reflecting on our own experience in prior disasters. What have we learned? Maybe it's entertaining hunches about the future. What do we think is going to happen Do we think the World Trade Center will collapse, or do we think that it will stand after the planes struck the building? Are we identifying emergent goals? What are the new priorities, for example, in a disaster situation? Are we developing mental models of what needs to be done, or are we learning on the job? That's part of spontaneous planning. Are we seeking the assistance of potential collaborators? If there's some experts or actors or agencies and departments that have a role in the disaster, are we talking to them and figuring out what we need to do together? That's part of it. Maybe it's looking for problem resolution, so we're presenting, critiquing, and negotiating options. And then finally, two other things. Maybe we're determining how to accomplish new priorities, so we're improvising. We're figuring out how to improvise, that is to say. And maybe we're also coordinating the activities of pertinent agencies as we implement the plan, the new plan that we've just talked about. So is this a valuable concept? Well, I think in many ways it still needs to be vetted and studied further. But I would argue that our research is too simple. If you look at the research, oftentimes there's kind of a dichotomy. There's literature about planning, and there's literature about improvisation. Well, is there something that's happening in between? People like Krebs believe that both things are important in emergency management. If that's true, what is the space between planning and improvisation? And I would argue that space, conceptually, is spontaneous planning. All right, so what I want to do is kind of shift gears and go over a case study that may help us to understand this a little bit. I'm going to run through it pretty quickly because I do want to have some time for questions when we're done. So my colleague Jim Kinder and I did receive a grant from the National Science Foundation. And the initial study, which included several scholars from the Disaster Research Center, which you'll see in the next slide, our goals were to look at how fires spread. There were certain scholars on the team developing models about how to suppress fires. And then Dr. Kinder and myself were more interested in resilience. How do organizations adapt and respond to stressful, extreme events called disasters? And so we really didn't have any particular agenda other than that. In fact, when we went out to study this disaster, we didn't even know anything about this concept of spontaneous planning. We actually gathered it from our study. So here's a list of the researchers that were involved in the study. Again, many of them were from the University of Delaware or the University of North Texas. Particularly myself, Lori Long, and Joshua Kelly are from UNT. So our study included, let's see if I can get this here. We had a small N. There was only 12 individuals that we interviewed for this study. It was kind of a quick trip out. We gathered research and then we came back. But we did talk to city leaders, people involved in emergency management or public health, others from the fire department, individuals from the Red Cross, people from the building department. So we interviewed these individuals. Typically an interview was about an hour long, and then we transcribed the data. And then we used that for our study. In the next two slides, I have a list of some of the questions that we ask. And again, we weren't really thinking at the time about spontaneous planning. We were just trying to figure out what do organizations do to respond and be resilient in the face of disasters. So we asked them about the problems they were facing, how pre-event planning helped them, where they were, who they were meeting with, those types of things. We asked them if they improvised in their disaster. And we asked them if they were meeting to kind of coordinate the response. We anticipated that that would be the case, of course, based on prior disaster studies and our prior experience in the field as well. And then we just wanted to get their overall thoughts about this. And again, as we interviewed these people, I had the question kind of come to my mind, is there planning taking place during the response that would help them to either implement the plan more fully with more details, or were they planning to improvise? And so that allowed us to maybe ask some new questions and form our study. So the case that we were looking at is the San Bruno gas pipeline explosion. San Bruno is a small town just south of San Francisco, so it's a suburban community. And being located in that area, the community is concerned about earthquakes. Now this community is small, so they don't have a dedicated full-time emergency manager, but interestingly they do have an emergency operations center. And the mayor and a lot of the city leaders and the fire chief have all talked a lot about planning for earthquakes and what they would do should something like that occur. So emergency management was a priority, although this didn't translate into having a full-time emergency management official. So what happened, and this was back on, if I remember, September 11th, 2010, there was a 30-inch pipeline in the Crestmore neighborhood of San Bruno. And what they found out after they studied the incident was there was a faulty weld on the pipeline when it was installed many, many years ago, decades ago, in this what was then a rural area. And then basically this neighborhood, basically grew on top of this pipeline. And in many ways, the city and others were not really fully aware where this pipeline was, which was right in the middle of the neighborhood. So the faulty weld ruptured. The pipeline was under enormous pressure with all of the gas flowing through the system, and the weld broke. When the weld broke, it caused the pipeline the pipe to move, which created a spark, which led to an explosion of this natural gas in this particular area. So it led to a major crater, the strong blast did. It was 72 feet long and about 26 feet deep, and this is kind of the aftermath of that explosion after workers had kind of sealed it off and kind of cleaned up the area a little bit. But that gives you an idea of where the pipeline was and what it looked like as well. So there was a major fire. 47.6 million cubic feet of natural gas was released when the pipeline exploded and afterwards before they could shut down the system. By the way, it took an hour and 45 minutes to turn off the valve for this particular pipeline. They initially thought that this might be some type of plane crash. Some of the initial reports that came in, for whatever reason, they assumed it was a plane that had crashed in the area, and that was certainly not the case. So I think that caused people to maybe respond to it differently than they should have. So that was one problem. Secondly, the community had to work with Pacific Gas and Electric to get this shut off, and for whatever reason it took the company a long time to figure out what valves they needed to turn off to shut the system down. So it burned for a long time before the valve was shut off. The blaze killed 8 individuals, it injured a variety of other people, a number of other people I should say, and it did have a pretty big impact upon the community, the neighborhood. So it destroyed 38 homes completely, damaged another 80 homes, and as the incident was unfolding, and this was in the early evening, about 5 or 6 at night, they were worried that it would spread, the fires would spread to other communities, and so they had to evacuate 300 homes in this particular neighborhood. Here's a kind of before and after picture to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So the picture on the left shows the homes and some of the vegetation in the area before the explosion. And then the next picture shows you really the same area where the pipeline was, and you can see where the fires spread as the incident unfolded. Here's another picture that shows the damage of the aftermath of the event. So what I want to do now is talk about spontaneous planning, and we believe, according to our research, that spontaneous planning was evident in some of the initial activities, mass care and media relations. It also was seen in damage assessment. As the community members re-entered their homes and their neighborhood, we saw spontaneous planning activities, and we saw it as well with debris management and some of the longer-term recovery issues. So let me talk about some of the examples that we saw as we uncovered this phenomena. So first of all, the fire station that responded first to this scene and the incident was located only 2 blocks away from the incident. So when the explosion occurred, the firefighters walked out of their building and they saw the big ball of fire, they saw the smoke plume, and they described it as a jet engine sound, so it was very loud. They self-dispatched. They didn't wait for 911 to call them. They were so close that they just got in their fire engines and drove 2 blocks, and there they were. And what was interesting is as they approached the scene, they realized that they were too close based on how the wind was blowing and where the fire was. And so they talked amongst themselves and determined that they would back up, drive up the street and around to a different street and approach the fire from a different area. And so this was maybe perhaps one example of this planning that took place to help them to respond to this disaster effectively and safely. The other thing that they did that was interesting is in many cases a fire department will respond. If they need help, they'll issue a second alarm. Once that crew shows up, they'll issue a third alarm, and so on until they have enough resources to respond to the disaster. Well, as they saw what was taking place, and they noted that homes were being engulfed in flames immediately because of the radiant heat from this gas explosion, they decided that they would issue several alarms at once to get resources there as soon as possible to have a very defensive posture and protect the other homes. So that was perhaps another example of this planning that was taking place. As they responded, unfortunately, they had a couple of challenges. One was to get people out of the area. The fire was spreading rapidly, so they wanted to make sure that they were protecting the people. So the firefighters went door to door, and of course they had to plan how that was going to take place. The fire chief was telling this firefighter, you go over in this area. He would tell this other firefighter, you go over in that area, and warn these people and get them out. The other challenge that they had is that they didn't have water to respond to this disaster initially. Unfortunately, this gas main, this gas line was actually located right above a water main, and so when the explosion occurred, it took out the water system as well. So even the nearby fire hydrants, there's a picture here you can see of a fire hydrant that's only maybe 150 yards from the explosion site. This didn't work. So the fire department, in order to solve this problem, they contacted the water department to try to figure out what hydrants were working in and around the area. Once the water department figured that out, they notified the fire department. The fire department laid hoses down that were extended for several blocks to the working fire hydrants. But there was a challenge that they had. They had to make sure that cars were not driving in the area because it would disrupt these hoses that they had just laid down. So the fire department had to work with the police department to coordinate where the hoses were and what roads need to be shut down there's another example of this spontaneous planning that took place. There's also another example. They had some water tenders that are 500-gallon tankers or tanks on trucks that would go to a fire hydrant far away, fill up, and then come in, and then the fire chief would coordinate where that tender would go to fight the fire. And they knew that some homes they couldn't protect at all. They were already engulfed. So what they did is they figured out what the next home they would try to target to save with these fire tenders. In addition to that, as they responded, there was another example of this, what we call spontaneous planning. This fire was really in a residential neighborhood, but there was kind of a gully with a lot of trees and shrubbery in the area, and so both the homes and this forest area caught on fire. So they had ground crews, of course, fighting the fires in the homes, but they also had this forested area that they had to deal with. So the fire department on the ground had to work with CAL FIRE to request air support, and this is kind of a unique event where the CAL FIRE air support teams brought in fire retardant and sprayed them over the houses and the forested area, which is not normally done. And this required a lot of planning because you had to figure out where the tankers were, these planes were coming from, how long it would take them to get there, how low they would need to fly. They had to drop the fire retardant, but also stay away from this big fireball, as you can see in this picture. And they also had to protect the emergency workers on the ground at the same time. If you dropped all of this fire retardant, you could actually injure a firefighter if they were in the path. So all of this had to be coordinated on the fly, required what we term spontaneous planning. Let me go through a couple of other examples here. Mass care and media relations. So immediately after the event, the American Red Cross workers met in their office in the county about an hour after the event, and they also talked to the city leaders, and they figured and they determined as they were communicating one with another that there were several homes that would be destroyed, and this neighborhood had to be evacuated. And again, this was, you know, at 5 or 6 at night. So they knew that people would need shelters. And so they planned to use the Veterans Memorial Rec Center in the community to assist with the evacuations that they anticipated in the sheltering. But this evacuation center was not just a place for people to stay. They also determined that it would be an assistance center. So besides just staying there, the victims or the families and individuals staying there could get help in terms of, you know, knowing what the government was doing, what assistance programs were out there from the nonprofit sector and so forth. And all of that had to be planned with other organizations, the Lions Club, the city, the Salvation Army, Pacific Gas and Electric. All of these organizations had some role in planning these mass care evacuation centers. They also had to figure out who would staff the phones in the city. A lot of calls were coming in, obviously. I'm sorry about, hopefully you can't hear that. It looks like someone has set off their car alarm. There it goes. I was talking about public information. The public information officers were overwhelmed. They were getting a lot of calls, and the city knew that they had to do something to address all these calls, and so they actually created shifts for workers to take these calls, 12-hour shifts on a 24-hour basis, and they had to figure out who would staff it, and so there was some planning that took place there. In terms of media relations, a lot of the media that showed up at the scene went to the Red Cross. The Red Cross had a communications vehicle in a parking lot in a shopping center, and they showed up there. That's where they staged their vehicles and so forth. And so it kind of almost happened spontaneously that this was going to be the place for the public relations and media relations taking place in the community. So the city had to plan what time they would have these briefings for the media. They had to figure out how to get a podium there, a microphone, speakers, those types of things as well. So there was a lot of coordination and planning for that. In addition, they also wanted to have a public hall town meeting to discuss what had happened later on, and that required them to plan with the various organizations that would have some role, whether it would be the Red Cross or whether it would be Pacific Gas and Electric to describe what happened with the pipeline, those types of things. And this was going to be held at St. Robert's Church, and so that had to be coordinated with this faith-based organization. So a lot of planning going on there as well. Let me run through a couple of others. I'll try to get these hit a little quicker. So damage assessment was very important after the event. A lot of damage assessment teams met the night of the incident. During that night, they basically planned what they would do for the next day, and they got prepared. So they copied forms, they got pens, paper, clipboards, those types of things. They divided the area into 6 quadrants, and they agreed what time they would meet the next day. I think they met at like 6:30 in the morning. And they met at in the garage or the bay of the fire department number 52 in San Bruno, which was just a few blocks away from the incident. And that's where they ran and managed the damage assessment process for the incident. Site control was also something that had to be planned out. You know, who would manage the shifts for security in terms of the police? How many fences needed to be brought in to keep people out of the dangerous area? Where would you put the fences? Later on, a security company was hired. How did they figure that out? All of these things had to be determined by planning on the fly. Now, of course, many of the things I'm talking about had been planned for in their emergency operations plan, but as far as the details, that's where spontaneous planning came into place, in our opinion. Victim reentry was a very good example of spontaneous planning. This was a very dangerous area, and a lot of the city and public health folks from the county were worried about people's safety. And yet they wanted to get people back in their homes. They wanted to allow people to gather their belongings from the ashes if they could salvage them, and they also needed people to start the insurance claims as well. So the city devised an idea of how to make sure that people could come in but do so in a safe and orderly fashion. And what they did after they planned all of this, they ended up staging people outside of the neighborhood. At this point they would check their identification. When they were allowed to come in, they would have to don equipment, whether it was a hard hat, gloves, Tyvek suits, things like that. They would be accompanied with the building officials and fire department representatives, and they were allowed to go in, look at their homes, gather anything that could be saved, and then when they left the scene, they would be able to clean up. All of this had to be coordinated and planned in advance. There was some spontaneous planning for the hillsides. You'll recall that I talked about the forested area that was engulfed and required the planes to come in to drop fire retardant. So these hills were denuded basically, and they were concerned about erosion and how that would affect the San Francisco Bay, and so they had to bring in some straw mats and so forth to protect the environment here. Debris removal was a big issue. There were damaged foundations, chimneys, glass, nails, twisted metal. There were cars that were burned. And so the San Mateo County Public Health and Cal Recycle worked together to plan how debris removal would take place. And one of the main issues that they had up front was who would pay for the cost of this. And Pacific Gas and Electric ended up being willing to pay, I think, $1.8 million to clean up the neighborhood and remove all of the debris, which was a nice gesture on their part after a tragic disaster. One of the things that they had to do was get the victims and owners to sign over rights for PG&E and Cal Recycle to do this removal, and so that had to take place. But the debris removal was handled under incident command, and every morning there were planning meetings to figure out what they would be doing, how they would remove the debris, and so forth. And the plan ended up removing the ash according to federal standards. It ended up recycling a lot of the wood, metal, brick, and concrete that could be recycled. In fact, about 58% of the debris was recycled, which was pretty impressive. There was some planning that took place in the long-term issues. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but there was a San Bruno Long-Term Recovery Center. There was planning that went into establishing that and determining who would be involved in that. There was lots of meetings to coordinate long-term recovery, planning of that recovery. And one of the things that they decided to do was to waive some of the rebuilding fees for the families and victims who had lost homes in this disaster. Now, in our opinion, there was one example where there was not spontaneous planning, and in our opinion, this actually hurt the response, and that was in relation to donations management. People ended up dropping clothing off near this Red Cross communications vehicle, and as somebody would do that, other people who were concerned about the victims brought things over, and they saw the donations dropped off there, and so they assumed this was the place you drop off donations, and so people just started dropping off donations whether they were needed or not. They had like an entertainment center and clothes dropped off in this particular area. In addition, people were buying gift cards from stores and trying to get them to the city to distribute for the disaster victims. In some cases, some of these gift cards included gift cards for candle stores, and it's uncertain how valuable these candles would be for people who had lost their homes. So that was something that just happened. It was emergent, but it wasn't necessarily planned. Finally, there was $400,000 given to the city by individuals who were concerned about the victims, and the city didn't give a lot of thought to what they would be doing with this $400,000. They were so concerned about the other pressing issues that there was not a lot of planning and foresight and coordination into what would happen about this $400,000. And that ended up being a problem later on because there was some disagreement about where the money should go and who should get the money and how much. So that was a problem. So let me provide a couple of quotes and try to wrap this up very quickly. Here was one quote from one of the responders to our study. Basically they said, what we try to do is anticipate what's going to be needed in the response and then get that job done. That was an example of spontaneous planning, and I really like this quote from someone else. I mean, literally, we had thought through every possible contingency in our mind. That's spontaneous planning, right? We had addressed it, and the operation was so smooth that people didn't even believe it themselves that they were able to pull it off. So that, in our mind, is what spontaneous planning is all about. So if this is true, and again, this is still preliminary research, so it needs to be verified and validated, but if this is true, if spontaneous planning does occur, we probably need emergency managers with some new skills. Maybe they need some new skills in terms of assessing situations, of communicating, of negotiating decisions, those types of things. It's also important that our practitioners focus more on planning when a disaster occurs. Of course, planning is an important part of ICS and NIMS. There is, in fact, a planning section. And so we would argue that this planning section is critical, but the only thing that we would probably add is that there's more people planning for the disaster than just the planning section itself. So there's people from the Red Cross who are planning what they're going to be doing. City officials, emergency managers are planning. So beyond first responders, there's many people planning on what they will do and how they'll respond to the disasters. And then finally, there's a lot of questions that we don't understand about spontaneous planning. Let me run through those very quickly. Is, for example, spontaneous planning a valid descriptor of response and recovery behavior in all types of disasters? So we try to show it in one disaster, but does this really occur in all disasters? What are the key characteristics of spontaneous planning? What are the connections between planning, improvisation, and spontaneous planning? I think we need to explore those relations further. Is spontaneous planning more common in response than it is in recovery? We need to learn more about that. When does spontaneous planning appear and when does it disappear? Should it be promoted as a key principle in emergency management or among first responders? And what skills would facilitate spontaneous planning? So in a nutshell, I think we have tried to show that we believe spontaneous planning occurs in disasters, but we really need a lot more studies to have any clear indication that yes, it is occurring and it's valuable for those dealing with disasters. So with that in mind, let me end now and thank you for listening to a very long presentation. Sorry about that. And let me open this up to questions if you have any. But don't all speak at once.
All right. I was just going to say, if anybody has a question for Dr. McEntire, even if you don't have a microphone, if you want to type it in at the bottom there, we can get your question. Very informative, very good presentation. And actually, most of our presentations are about 45 to 50 minutes, so it was right on cue with what we normally do. Excellent presentation.
Okay,
any questions for Dr. McEntire? Pius.
Yeah, I would just want a little light thrown into assigning responsibilities. You said responsibility should be assigned to specific, is it to individuals or to positions? How do you differentiate this?
Well, that's a great question. And let me answer it in a couple of different ways. First of all, during the planning process before a disaster, there should be some type of planning committee, like a local emergency planning committee, LEPC, and hopefully they're figuring out what needs to be done and who should be involved. For example, a lot of cities put the Red Cross in charge of sheltering because they have that expertise, and so part of it is identifying that before a disaster occurs. But even in a disaster, there's a need to make sure functions are being fulfilled by someone. In some cases, emergence takes care of that. People see there's a need and they just do it themselves and they solve the problem. In other cases, there needs to be a discussion of some of the key leaders or decision makers or policy makers and politicians to figure out who's going to do what. And so that's how they would assign some of those responsibilities.
Thank you.
Other questions for Dr. McEntire?
Dr. H, you want one?
All right, Dr. McEntire, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I'm not sure if Dr. Yelda told you or not, but we do archive all the presentations, and then many times what we'll do is, for our other classes, we'll have our students listen to the archive presentation. So we appreciate it very much. Thank you for your time. And with that, I'll say good afternoon to everybody, and everybody hopefully have a great weekend.
Okay, well, thank you. It was a pleasure, and good luck to all of your students.
Thank you.
Bye.